Thank you, Isabel. That sounded impressive, didn't it? And you know, she didn't even use the accolade that my wife tells everyone. He's a legend in his own mind. Well, as you can tell, I've been writing for a long time, and every now and then someone will come up to me and ask how I got started or what's it like to be a writer. And so I quote Ray Bradbury, the author of Fahrenheit 451, The Martian Chronicles. Bradbury said, "Some people hear voices when no one is there, and some of them are put away as mad in a little room where they stare at the wall all day. And others are called writers, and they do pretty much the same thing." Well, I have to agree with Mr. Bradbury, but when I wasn't staring at walls, I managed to write 18 books. And as Isabel so kindly told you, 6 were novels. That's how I started. But the last 9 years I've been working as a biographer and ghostwriter and written 12 different ones. Let me ask you a question. How many of you are Florida natives? 1, 2, 3. Well, that's about right. Most of us came from other states, right? And in fact, almost 1,000 people a day move to the Sunshine State. And if I had to guess, it's not only the sunny skies and the beautiful beaches, but there's something that we don't have that attracts people. Do you know what that is?
Income tax.
State income tax. Very good. He gets a brownie point.
I just want the brownie.
Well, believe it or not, you can thank James Anthony for that, as I'll be telling you. We have lost my place. Mr. Anthony was rather an obscure but pivotal figure in Florida history. And tonight I'll be talking about that history, and we are so lucky to live in an area that's so rich in history. And the museum, Isabel, they do such a wonderful job in protecting and preserving that history. And like the museum, that's been my job for almost 10 years now, preserving personal histories of people. And I'm excited tonight to tell you about this man and how he changed Florida's history. James R. Anthony, the banker who shaped Florida's history, documents this man from a poor Georgia farm boy to what one historian called Florida's king of chain banks. In the book, you'll read about his backroom dealings, the backstabbings, and how he put more money in your pocket by helping to change the Florida Constitution. And much of it is in his own words. While I work with people to help them preserve their life's legacy, I do a lot of research. I've been combing through documents and reading books and looking through photographs. Here are some of the nonfiction, the biographies I've written for individuals. Most of these people live in our area, but of all the books I've written, I have to say Mr. Anthony's is one of the most fascinating, because it's extremely rare to find the kind of historical documentation that I was able to use to write his book. His granddaughter, Sarah Anthony, had inherited 5 journals that James had written. Her grandfather had written, excuse me. And she turned them over to me when she asked me to write his biography. The journals documented his life and his business history, starting with his father. And his father was fought for the Confederacy, and he actually was wounded in the 6 Days Battle at Mechanicsville, and he went on to fight at the Battle of Olustee near Lake City. He was basically a part-time teacher and a farmer after that. As I read the journals, however, what I saw was his life intersected with so much of early Florida's history that this became as much a Florida history book as it was a biography of James R. Anthony. And so I did a lot of research. I read more than 24 books. I spent hours and hours on the internet finding old documents and reports that I use within the book. He was both an observer and a participant in the profound changes that came along on in the Sunshine State during the early 1900s. Here's how I described his role in the book's introduction. His life would be a steady climb through Florida's sunshine and shadows. Anthony lived during some of the state's most turbulent times, a historic period filled with ambition and excess, vast riches and incalculable losses. He documented it with insider details and personal knowledge of the tycoons and tourists, promoters and posers he came to know. James R. Anthony, the banker who shaped Florida's history, describes the rise of a family whose history is explicitly intertwined with the story of Florida and the men who conquered a wilderness and changed it forever. Let me introduce you to Sarah's family. Okay.
It's gonna work. No.
There they are. These are the 3 generations of the Anthony family. Each one of these men are named James Rembert Anthony. On the left you see the Confederate veteran, the great old granddad. On the right is the subject of the book, James Anthony, and the child on granddad's lap is Sarah's father, James III, if you will. Well, Anthony grew up on a Georgia farm, small Georgia farm. He was the oldest of 5 children. They all had been homeschooled by the father, an experience he wrote about in his first journal, where he was looking back at his early years. And this is part of what he wrote. The experience we boys gained from this combination of a good rudimentary education mixed with work on a farm stood us in wonderful stead in later years. We had good health, learned the value of $1, and got such training based on the original good stock of our parents as enabled us to hold our own in most any situation. The fact that I've picked cotton with Negroes, plowed a mule all day, milked cows, and on occasion, when we had visitors, slept in the cotton seat pile for lack of a bed that has never since interfered with my sitting on a board of bank directors with millionaires or on a trip to Europe and feeling at home in their finest palaces. Well, Mr. Anthony and his younger brother Gus, actually it's Henry, attended Georgia Tech, but only for a short time, and the only reason they were able to do that was the father who taught there for a short time. But old granddad had health problems, and he had to quit his job at Georgia Tech, and shortly after that, the 2 brothers caught the flu, and they returned home to the Georgia farm. And when they got there, they found that they didn't have any money to return to school. So Anthony decided he would plant his own crop on the farm, cotton and vegetables, and he would use that money as a stake to make his way in life. He raised his crop, he sold it for $129, and he went where everybody in the South seemed to go in Georgia. They went to Atlanta, right? He struggled to find a job for weeks, but everybody he interviewed with said, "Can you type? Can you take shorthand?" And he'd say no. So right away he found a school and he learned to be a very good stenographer. And he worked for a short time for the Atlanta Constitution with no pay. because the editor told him that he would give him the first good job that came along. And he believed him and kept working. One of the editors he worked with was Joel Chandler Harris, the author of the Uncle Remus tales. But the editor was good to his word, and he found a good paying job, $7 a week. Shortly thereafter, he was working with the company that put in the first electric trolley system in Atlanta. But that led to a much better job working on a major railroad project up in Pittsburgh. Now you might wonder how he influenced Florida's history. If he was working and living in Pennsylvania. Well, you can thank his two brothers, Henry and Gus, for that, because they moved from Georgia to Titusville, Florida, and they scraped together a little money and bought a little store that had gone out of business, and they sold sundry items, whatever those are, and they were having a hard time staying in business. So Mr. Anthony would send them money after every paycheck to keep them afloat. But eventually, he finished with the Pittsburgh job. He came down to Florida and joined his two brothers. And with that action, the Anthony Brothers brand was born. And they switched from selling those sundry goods to men's clothing. And after Henry Flagler extended his railroad to Palm Beach, that should have been there for the last 5 minutes. Now you know what he looks like, right? He built the Royal Poinciana Hotel in Palm Beach. They saw what was happening in South Florida, and so they sold that little store, and they moved to West Palm Beach and opened a store there. When Flagler decided, once he was down there, to move the railroad bridge about a half mile down the way because it was too close to his fancy mansion, Whitehall, he needed a piece of property, and he found out that the Anthony brothers had a lease on that property. So Anthony wrote that Flagler, yes, came rolling into his store in a wheelchair. And he told them, he explained that he was going to build 6 retail stores in front of this grand hotel. And he would let them rent one of those stores in exchange for that piece of property that they had. And they jumped on it because they realized that this is where they needed to be. He also told them that they would be the only men's clothing store among the 6. And they were really happy. And when the season came around, you know, back then, basically the hotels were only open during the tourist season. They went in to set up their new store, and they were surprised to find a major competitor of theirs had one of the other stores. Obviously, they were upset. They went and complained to Mr. Flagler, and he said, "I'm sorry, unbeknownst to me, the hotel manager has given them a 1-year lease." But he encouraged them, "You go ahead and hang in there this season, and I'll take care of you next year." And he said, "A little competition never hurt anyone." And in his journal, Anthony wrote that his brother Gus dryly noted that was a funny statement coming from the vice president of the Standard Oil Company. Mr. Flagler ha-ha'd and said, "That was sure a blow below the belt, but it tickled him greatly." Well, whoops, let's go back. Mr. Flagler was true to his word. He kicked the other men's clothing store out the following year, and they were the only one there, and they stayed there for quite a while. Here's what Anthony wrote about his deal with Flagler. We made a fortune out of that store, catering exclusively to the richest people in the world, furnishing them with only the best stuff money could buy, and charging them all they would stand. They never cared about the price as long as you didn't attempt to put off shoddy goods on them. He wrote about ordering Panama hats from Cuba. The price was $17.50 each hat, including delivery to Florida. And he turned around and charged them $100 a hat. So you can see what a savvy businessman he is. The brothers eventually expanded their retail outlets to 4 stores in Daytona Beach and Miami and Palm Beach and one other place. And Anthony turned his sights to real estate because South Florida was starting to really bubble at that point. And he said it was comparatively easy to make money on real estate. He wrote, "The country was growing and the tendency of all values was upward. You just had to get in the way of it." Okay, that's the one. In the book, I write about many of the people who helped shape Florida's history. People like, wait a minute, not you. People like Julia Tuttles and William Brickell. They were early settlers and landowners in Fort Dallas, and they gave Henry Flagler hundreds of acres to extend his railroad from Palm Beach to Miami. That's what Fort Dallas became. It turned into the city of Miami. And another one is Carl Fisher. He's a millionaire entrepreneur. Anybody ever heard of Carl Fisher? No. Okay. He built the Indianapolis Speedway. He created the Lincoln Highway. And he dredged 9 miles of shoreline and filled it in to create the barrier island we know as Miami Beach. Will Rogers said that Carl Fisher was the man who took Miami away from the Indians and gave it to the Indianas. He said if there had been no Carl Fisher, Florida today would be known as the Turpentine State. Across town, George Merrick had a dream. He saw Palm Beach and Miami as places for the wealthy to come during the tourist season, but he imagined a place for the average American that could live year-round. He had inherited 160 acres of orange groves from his father, and he was able to purchase another 1,000 acres of the tropical scrubland, and he turned that into Coral Gables. Oh, wow. Then there was this gentleman. Where was that? There he is. His name is Hamilton Diston. Look at Hamilton for a second. Hamilton Diston was a Philadelphia manufacturer. And he took advantage of the state of Florida when they were badly in debt, and he purchased 4 million acres for 25 cents an acre. That adds up, if my math is correct, to $1 million. And that was money he didn't have and he never paid. Pretty sure, huh? But the biggest player on the stage during this time had to be Henry Flagler, right? Mm-hmm. Along with John D. Rockefeller, they founded the Standard Oil Company, and they turned it into the world's largest and biggest monopolies. And by 1891, however, Flagler was semi-retired. His first wife, Mary, had died, and he was reassessing his life. He kept reassessing and kept getting richer. 2 years later, he was worth between $10 and $20 million, which is about $200 million today. And he was happily remarried to Ida Alice Shorts, a woman who was 18 years younger than him. Ida Alice had been a nurse, and when his first wife, Mary, went into decline, she helped nurse him along, her along. She may have nursed him too, because very soon thereafter, she became Mrs. Henrietta Flagler. Now, the books I read said she was young and attractive, but she had a limited education and had no interest in intellectual pursuits, if you will. She did have a great interest, though, in Flagler's bank account. And she spent enormous amounts of money buying every high-level gown she could find in New York City. In 1893, the couple took a belated honeymoon, staying at St. Augustine's New San Marco Hotel. Flagler liked the climate, but he was underwhelmed by the old city. He later wrote that he would take daily walks down St. John's Street, around the plaza to the clubhouse, and back to his hotel again. He said he saw other gentlemen doing the very same thing because that was all they had to do. He wrote that it occurred to me that someone with sufficient means ought to provide accommodations for that class of people who are not sick but are here to enjoy the climate, have plenty of money, but could find no satisfactory way of spending it. And so he built Ponce de Leon Hotel, the state's first great resort. And he used a new construction project that he learned from Franklin Smith, who built Villa Zareta before him. Eventually, though, Flagler felt he was being taken advantage in St. Augustine. Everybody was trying to get money out of him, and he got tired of all that, and he decided to up and move, and that's when he sent his railroad down south to Palm Beach and later to Miami. Now, to backtrack a little bit, when Miami-Dade County was first originated, it was huge. It was over 7,500 square miles. And at the time, there were 750 people living there. They went from the Upper Keys to Stuart, Florida. Well, once Mr. Anthony was there and all these businessmen were starting to build up the Palm Beaches, they felt they needed their own county. And they started to lobby the legislature, the state legislature. They did a very good job of it because in 1909, the legislature, that legislative session created 22 new counties, including Palm Beach County. Now, a key part of the book deals with Mr. Anthony's role in the Witham banking system. It was a chain of small Georgia banks created by this man, William Witham. We're told that Witham was a super salesman. He would go into these small Georgia towns like Professor Harold Hill, you know, the music man, but instead of selling musical instruments, he convinced these townsfolk they needed a bank. And he built up his stretch of banks, his system of banks, until 1911 there were 125 of them. And most of them were in Georgia, but he wanted to expand into Florida. And he was looking for someone to help him. And that turned out to be James R. Anthony. He found out that Mr. Anthony had helped a friend of his save his bank in Florida that had gone into deep troubles. Well, after Witham retired, he handed the leadership of his banking enterprise to this man, W.D. Manley, who is a lot younger, but he had sort of interned under Witham. And one thing I wrote said about his only qualifications was he really knew how to suck up. So, but you read about how Manley and Anthony worked together for 10 years. And they worked together very well. They were quite cooperative and friendly, but it didn't end well. Anthony proved to be an excellent banker. He had connections all through the states, and he grew his Florida chain to 60 banks. He was basically in charge of those 60 banks. He became president of the Florida Bankers Association, and in 1925, in his outgoing speech before the Bankers Convention that year in Jacksonville, he proudly proclaimed that their greatest achievement under his leadership was the successful effort the organization made to pass the 1924 constitutional amendment prohibiting personal income and estate and investment taxes. So we have again, thank you very much, Mr. Anthony. Well, the amendment was a great success. Many people started coming to Florida to invest in real estate, but it also started attracting a different element. A lot of gangsters moved to South Florida, including this man. You recognize him? Alphonse Capone? Well, you know, he had a bad rap, right? But I like to think of Mr. Capone as a bit of a philosopher. He once said, "You can get more with a kind word and a gun than you can with a kind word alone." I bet that's true, right? Well, he moved to Miami Beach, and he purchased this house on Miami Beach, in Miami Beach, right on the waterfront. He threw extravagant parties, inviting everyone he knew, both the legal and the illegal. But the police wouldn't leave him alone, and the newspapers would write editorials condemning him, and sooner or later he got tired of it, and then he lost a lot of his money, and the police arrested him, and his property was taken away by the courts. Finally, not quite finally, but almost finally, you're going to read about the great boom of 1924 and 1925. You'll read about the developers who helped fuel the boom. They sold millions of dollars worth of property to these thousands of people that were flocking to South Florida. George Merrick, the creator of Coral Gables, hired this man, William Jennings Bryan, three-time presidential nominee, for $100,000 a year to promote his properties. This is Bryan at his Merrick's Venetian pool, speechifying to potential buyers, if you will. Another person that was hired to ballyhoo the developer's property is Ben Hecht. I don't know if any of you recall Ben Hecht. He went on to become, he was a journalist and a publicity kind of guy, but he went to Hollywood, became a screenwriter and a director. This is how he described the South Florida boom. He said, "Everybody was trying to get rich in a few days. Nobody sat under the palm trees. Nobody played horseshoes. Seduction was at a standstill. Everybody was stubbing his toe on real estate nuggets." Well, the Florida developers were advertising in the nation's biggest newspapers in major cities. And as I said, thousands of people continued flooding into South Florida. They took the trains, they took boats. Model T was up and running then. They were called Tin Can Lizzies, these tourists that came in on Model Ts. On the right is an early traffic jam on Biscayne Boulevard. And during a frigid winter in 24-25 in the Northeast, Carl Fisher took out this huge billboard in Times Square that said, "It's June in Miami." Miami's bank deposits soared from $37 million in 1924 to more than $210 million the next year. A front foot on Flagler Street, if you can believe this, sold for $50,000, only to be raised to $70,000 the following month. And at the boom's peak, more than 25,000 people were engaged in selling real estate. And the Miami Herald became the largest newspaper in the world in terms of advertising. One issue published 22 sections of advertising containing 504 pages. A woman said she'd like to take the Sunday paper, but I'm afraid it will fall on me. Of course, everything that goes up comes down. A land developer in St. Petersburg was quoted as saying, "We just ran out of suckers." We got all their money, then started trading with ourselves. We became the suckers. Poor guy. Well, that Florida boom crashed in 1926. It brought with it many of the banks around the state of Florida and throughout Georgia. Tens of thousands of people lost life savings. This is the West Palm Beach Bank. You see all the customers lined up hoping to get inside and get a little bit of their money. When this particular bank crashed, James Anthony had owned a lot of stock in it and helped get it up and running. A lot of the depositors blamed him for what was happening. But he defended himself. He said, he wrote in his journal, "I had as far back on December 1924 sold every share of stock I had in Palm Beach Bank and Trust Company and was neither an officer nor director. It failed in 1926 during the general smash, and the attempt was made to fasten the responsibility on me. It was a most ridiculous attempt and the only one of the kind in the state." Well, that whole system that he was a part of, what had been the Witham banking system, was investigated by the feds. W.D. Manley and 6 of his associates were indicted and sent to prison. There's an interesting couple of chapters about Manley and the extent he went to try to stay out of prison. So I think you'll enjoy it, and how he had himself sent to a mental institution for a while. But Mr. Anthony was farsighted. He disentangled himself. He saw, I think, that the boom was just too hot, and the bubble had to burst at some time. So he disentangled himself from that business. And he and his brother Gus, as far back as 1914, had moved to Jacksonville, out from South Florida. And they had set up their new headquarters for the banking system in Jacksonville. He purchased the People's Bank in Jacksonville at the time, and he somehow transitioned into the insurance business. And what had happened is the Florida Insurance Commissioner was trying to deal with an insurance company, the Florida Life Insurance Company, that was almost about to go out of business. They were really struggling, and he knew Mr. Anthony's reputation for saving troubled banks and institutions. So he kind of leaned on him and asked him if he would help save this insurance company, and they made him a secretary and treasurer of the company. And he basically did save it. He found a massive insurance fraud that the president of the company had been undertaking for years. He stayed with the insurance company after they merged with Peninsular Life, and then Occidental Life took them over, and at that point he sold all his stock and he retired. That was in 1936. And I'm sorry, what was your name back there?
Richard.
Richard. I was telling Richard earlier about his banking business, because Richard was quite a banker in his day.
Not as big as these guys.
And he asked me, well, did he make any money? He made a lot of money. And anyway, I told you bits and pieces about the life and times of James R. Anthony, but you're going to have to read the book to find out why a decommissioned Danish naval ship was in the Miami harbor, and why when it sunk, some historians blame it for causing the Great Depression. But you'll have to read it. I will tell you though, of all the biographies I've written, and many of the ones I've read, this one is one of the most fascinating. Because it's about a man whose impact during his life we're still feeling today. Well, thank you very much. Before I go back to staring at walls, I do have some books if anybody's interested. I'll be happy to sign them. And I'm also happy to answer any questions you might have. I'll go with you first, sir.
Sure. So I bought your book and I highly recommend it to everyone.
Oh, thank you.
I haven't finished it, but I want to ask a question. Hopefully I'm not going to spoil the ending.
Spoilers.
Yeah, I noted, as you pointed out, that a lot of your information comes from his journals.
Right.
And, you know, journals are written by the author himself, and you would think they're going to put a positive, constructive story together. And as you point out, you put all these banks together, and yet magically, apparently, sold out of all of them just before the crash.
Right.
And as I read, and then you pointed out, there's another book written that is more critical of
Right.
his role in all of that. So I'm naturally curious. You've done all the research. I assume you've read both accounts. What's your assessment in terms of?
You know, this is an interesting question. Oh, by the way, the best way to thank an author is to leave a great review.
There you go.
Go on Amazon and leave a review. When I got to that part
Yeah.
in his story, I went to Sarah, who hired me. And she, I should tell you, she hired me just to write this book as a legacy project for her family and friends. She was just going to distribute it. And I got to the end, and I had shown it to a few people, and everybody seemed to think, this is a great book, you should make it available. So I went back to Sarah, and I asked her if I could make it available for sale, and she said, sure, go ahead. But when I got to the point that you're talking about, where there was a lot of criticism about this banking system and Anthony's role in it, and why he wasn't indicted with some of the other people, I went back and talked to Sarah, because I didn't want to put anything in there that was totally negative if it was just going to be for her family. And she said that, gosh, I'm not even sure I knew about all that. And so we talked about it, and I said, you know, there's always two sides to a story. And Raymond Vickers, the man you talked about, was involved in the banking system, and he wrote a book critical about everything that had gone down. And but I found a couple of others from historians who were saying that they had a different system back then, and that yes, developers were given sweetheart deals from the banks, but that's why they set up these banks in the first place. For the most part, they're the ones who started the banks, and they expected these sweetheart deals. So, you know, you can look at it both ways.
Yeah.
I think he was a very shrewd businessman, and he indeed got out of that more than a year before the crash. So I can't really blame him for that. Maybe there are things he could have done or should have done. I don't know. So we'll just let him rest in peace. Richard.
Yeah, you showed us a picture of the Royal Ponciana
Yes.
Hotel, which I understand is gone.
Is it?
I don't know. Do you know the outcome of that hotel?
Well, it probably burned down. A couple of those. So the Ponce de Leon is still there because it was built with not stucco, coquina. Thank you. and the system they used, basically they had molds and they'd pour this in there and they basically made concrete with it. But after that, you would think he would continue that, but maybe he didn't have a supply of coquina. He made the rest of his hotels out of wood. And
So the hotel's gone.
I'd have to go back, I don't know, I can't recall if they rebuilt it or not.
According to Google, it's gone.
It is gone?
Yeah, according to
Okay.
Google.
Okay,
Yeah.
but it was there for a while, and they did quite well. And there was another one of his hotels, the Breakers in Palm Beach, that also burned down, but that was rebuilt. I read an interesting anecdote about that while everybody had evacuated the hotel and the firemen were working on one end of the hotel, the thieves broke into the rooms and were stealing all their belongings while they had evacuated. Sounds like today's state.
Yeah.
Do you have a question?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember the date that the Federal Reserve was created. I'm wondering if somehow this banking failure here helped.
Federal Reserve,
Federal Reserve.
1913.
1930.
Yeah.
Jekyll Island,
The
Georgia.
creature of Jekyll Island. Yeah.
And many of the practices that he and I think others
Right.
were doing were over time outlawed through various regulations. So the chain system, as I understand it,
Right.
you start one bank, you borrow from it, and use
Exactly.
that loan to capitalize the next one, repeat. And that's why how many did you say, 60?
60 in Florida,
He had
125 in
brilliant
Georgia.
A year in advance, and I get that,
Right.
that is great foresight to get out that far in
Sure,
advance, but the whole, and I assume this was going on lots of other places.
I
not
would
just-
assume so.
yeah.
Witham, who started, actually had one or two banks in New York and a couple of other
Yeah.
states.
So,
And the way he had the system set up is he took a fee from each bank every year. So that was his income, and I think it probably grew each year. So he did very well. He had a mansion on Peachtree Street in Atlanta, and Manly outdid him. I had an even bigger house, and he spent like a Saudi prince, if you will. He bought all these cars, and I'm not going to ruin it for you. Anyway, any more questions?
I've gotten to the transition to insurance bit, and I think that basically he started doing the same thing in the insurance world. So start insurance companies, issue policies, collect the premiums, and then rinse and repeat with insurance.
Well, for the first, let's see, you moved there, I think about 1914, 15. You want me to go?
Oh, no.
Oh, okay. I thought you were wrapping me up. For the first 5 or 6 years he had moved to Jacksonville. He was still working mostly with the banking system, and the insurance company was sort of a side job, if you will. He didn't really invest a lot of his time. So a lot of things were happening that he claims he had no idea was going on. And it was only when he was able to really concentrate on it and they found fraud in that system. Well, thank you very much, folks. I appreciate it.